Hey, welcome back to reading my second book, Deviations of Defiance by J.S. Golson. And we are picking up on Chapter 5, Meeting. Back in the tavern, the two dwarves stared at each other. Eneptius reached out his hand and said, "I'm Eneptius, Security." This seemingly rich dwarf had a surprisingly rolling voice about him. Most had deep, gruff voices, but Eneptius noticed that this was no older dwarf than himself. Well, maybe a couple of years older. "Men are strange, my friend. Most just can't give up wealth like that. Give it time and he'll learn," this new dwarf stated as if he knew the nature of the universe. Eneptius cast his eyes downward at this last statement, commiserating with the dwarf. It was as if he knew he should have paid, but this new sentiment let him off the hook. "By the way, I'm Dorith," the dwarf said in a lilting voice that ebbed and flowed from his mouth, like the ocean being pulled by the moon. "It's a pleasure to meet someone new around here." Eneptius responded rather drunkenly. "I would have thought you'd have been seeing new faces every day living here. It's so damn big." They both shared a hearty chuckle upon shaking each other's hands. Meeting someone new seemed to cheer up this dwarf. It was a bit strange to hear such a voice come out of a dwarf, but who was Eneptius to complain after making a new friend? Eneptius took a double take. He was now in a crowded and low building, with a bar leading around a rather large room that had alcoves built into the sides for people to get more comfortable. There was an enormous amount of tobacco smoke rising to the top of the wattle ceiling. Almost everyone had their pipes out in all different shapes and sizes, huge ones and small ones, carved and simple, elongated and tiny versus short and fat pipes. There was probably only one rule in this tavern: keep your smoke pointed up. Every one of the people there made sure to expertly do their tricks toward the roof, and those who didn't quickly received a stern push. When the push came to a shove, it turned into a brutal fight between the two overly intoxicated parties. Eneptius was never the most astute of dwarves, but even he realized that there were only others of his kind in this pub. He must have been so distracted by his thoughts that he had completely missed everything upon his first entrance, though it should have come as no surprise considering the way Dorith was dressed. Eneptius could tell right away that this dwarf was on the more wealthy side of life, and most likely a Dvarnin in Ramarden, or at least a special pet of Honorian. Eneptius's parents had raised him with the general principle that if anyone was richer than you, try your damnedest to befriend that person. It helped in this case that Eneptius was a stranger, so Dorith had no idea of his lowly position as a serf. The way Eneptius seemed to operate was definitely not in the spirit of looking out for those below himself. Heck, he was already at the bottom. I must say, however, that Eneptius did relax his shoulders a bit upon realizing that there were only dwarves in this tavern. Most of the dwarves that he could see through the smoke wore long gray beards. Those were full of plaits and braids that any dwarf mother would be proud to see their sons wearing. There were a surprising amount of variation in the clothes as well, which he could try to make out in the seemingly endless darkness. All shades of the different colors of the rainbow were able to be made out by Eneptius's quickly adapting dwarf eyes. Then our dwarf looked in another direction of the tavern. There were all manner of folk down in that section of the smoke-filled room. He could tell that there were young and old dwarves just based on the sizes and lengths of their beards. Of course, the color was also a clear signifier in the diverse crowd. It was not so unusual to see the curvy forms of dwarf women in that den. There were quite a few, surprisingly. The younger amongst them had classic dwarven braids that reached to their hips at least. All of their eyes shined brightly in the warmth of that place. The fierce candlelight shone brightly from the top of the tavern in brilliantly carved chandeliers made from the antlers of wild bucks in the forest. From what Ineptius could perceive, it was a place of seemingly vast quantities of wealth. The walls were decorated in grand tapestries and carvings of wood. Where there were not professional trappings on the walls, then there were amateur portraits of carved women or some girls lost in love. Ineptius realized that his seat was lined in a very rich and warm kored fur. Now the kored is a wild animal originating in the Samarsan Mountains, reaches to the far north of Ramarden. It is a strange split between a bear and a rabbit, where it has long ears like a bunny, and sprightly legs like one too, but it is still a fierce animal such as the bear, with sharp fangs and the strong arms, and with a wide belly like one. The kored is a rather ungainly creature in and of itself, though there have been incidents known of the creature mutating over time to develop strongly muscled legs to support its body. Originally, the kored was seen as easy prey for hunters and other animals among the like of predators. But with this seemingly new breed of kored, the weaker animals were then protected by these horrifying creations of nature. And so the kored swiftly gained a reputation which deterred the hunters from attacking them. Now the fur on these strange animals was quite exquisite, highly sought after by tavern owners in Varneen. Ineptius could not tell at once that it was quite a pickle he had walked into here. Being raised among the human serfs did not incline him to become friends with them. Most looked down on his family and blamed them for the unfortunate situation that they, the humans, were in. There was always a measure of uneasiness in everything that Ineptius did. A lot of self-doubt also was apparent in his thinking. Whenever doing something as a child, be it farming the potatoes or simply starting a fire, his father would micromanage to make sure that Ineptius was doing it correctly. Rolov would ask why his children were incompetent, and pretend as if he did not know that he was the reason for it. Now, all this combined to make one great dwarf out of Ineptius. Since he was not the most beloved in the village, he did not have many friends, and so he spent that time where other serf children were playing at pretending to be ritzers, on studying at the chapel with the priests, and learning about the everlasting love of Gorgonus. Ineptius had dreams of becoming a priest for the god, or even a monk, but the world always seemed to get in his way, though he thought that he had been blessed simply because everything in his life turned out well, even though the hardships and difficulty of life tried to overwhelm him. Even Marcellus, Matthias, and Sammius were back in his life now, so he was pleased in that situation. It was another thing that seemed to go his way, even through all this hardship. The knowledge that they would all journey together soon comforted him in his inebriated state. That being said, Ineptius did not have such a tact for talking to people, even though he was the best one at it in one-on-one scenarios. The dwarf enjoyed living in his mind, as he was doing right at that instant. He had really captured the art of small talk in the cases where no one realized that he was simply repeating himself over and over again to various different people. Ineptius, for the longest time, thought that it was interesting to see how different people would react to the same questions. Eventually, even this got too old for him, as he started to notice that many different people all had the same answers. Ineptius always seemed to have this great anxiety about himself, on whether or not he would be able to stand on the same ground as someone else who was actually good at talking to people. He had met several of them in the village, mostly the elders for the humans who helped to make sure that everything ran smoothly in Atrodnaya. It was interesting in the ways that he had seen them talking to everyone. He had seen them getting to know people on a personal level, seemingly. This council of elders convened at least once a month in order to peacefully settle disputes between people in the village. After much pleading and bargaining, Roloff eventually was given a seat there to represent the interests of the more downtrodden in society. Though he was a pragmatic man, he held a keen eye out in order to make things fair and just between the parties in the village. Eneptius broke out of his daydreaming. For several minutes he had just been sitting there swooning back and forth. Now Doroth and Eneptius faced each other solidly. Everyone in this tavern was sporting such fanciful and unnecessary colors. They were clearly either Dvarnin themselves or closely linked to that class of dwarves. A comely dwarf bar-maiden came up to greet them out of nowhere. The fat barkeep had seemingly disappeared, much to the enjoyment of Eneptius. She held her hair in the style of older dwarven women, which was loose with nothing in it to halt the flow of glowing brown locks which fell from her head. In the darkness there was one thing that made her stand out to the two men. That was the very shapely size of her breasts, which were loosely held captive by the tight dress that lay upon her, showing every inch of that fine dwarven body to the local customers. Eneptius's eyes certainly alighted upon this very ingratiating facet of her. He tried hard to pull them away, out of fear of offending such a sprightly specimen of attraction. Now, Eneptius was also not used to seeing dwarven women from such a close distance. Normally he had seen the family of Ornorian from far away, and sure, he had a rather attractive daughter, but then again Eneptius thought that most women were attractive. The human girls in Atrodnaya were not so choosy as some distant Gersog's daughter. Better yet, the young dwarf seemed to have a way with them. On the individual level, he was able to attract quite a number of young serf girls without doing much. He was, naturally, a handsome baby-faced young lad, though the beard tended to hide that fact. He attracted such girls who had never really known a dwarf before him, in the personal sense, that is. He would woo women and win their hearts over in a matter of weeks, if not days. It was the matter of moving on between them all that really made life in the village hard. Maybe upon his return to the outside world, the many women who had fallen in love with him and placed their hopes upon his shoulders would look more kindly on Eneptius. Currently, however, he was drunk and loving it. Equally, it was interesting in how Eneptius seemed to be able to win over his lovers' families. Most serfs would be opposed to a relationship between their daughters and a dwarf, but he had quite a way of being simple-minded enough where everyone looked on Eneptius as an easy friend and avid listener. Whomever it was talking to the dwarf, Eneptius always held an ear open to them regardless of what they were talking about. Often he had not learned how to really talk to people. His conversations took more of a listen and ask questions style. It always went like an interview. Not much back and forth was required for this easy conversation method. Eneptius simply nodded his head and smiled in response to what was being said. The dwarf found in life that it helped really to just wear a smile on his face, and people always seemed friendlier, no matter what the circumstance they were in. This became a great source of pride for Eneptius. "Can I get you, dear, something?" The daydream was once again broken, of Eneptius's almost former life in Atrodnaya, by the sweet voice and smell of this tantalizing barmaid. Doroth answered with a hearty, "2 beers, my lady, and make it fast!" We're damn thirsty here." With that, the dwarf woman departed, and soon reappeared with 2 more large pints foaming at the top. The fizz from the freshly poured cold liquid was bubbling wildly. Dorothy took a long swig of that delicious beverage, while Aneptius took small gulps here and there. Soon he took one large taste. The flavor was now much more bearable. As we all know, the more you drink, the better it tastes. Dorothy made a large inhale of breath and said, "So where are you from, Aneptius?" Aneptius looked him straight in the eyes as he answered, "I'm from here, you idiot. It's a nice little place if you haven't noticed. But you know, a nice little village like this isn't the place for an enterprising dwarf like myself to do anything with. Are you from around here, Dorothy?" "Thought you would never have asked." "No, my friend. I'm from a large and prosperous trading swamp over in Romarkia, called Vinorg." Now with this statement of origin, Aneptius let out an eternal groan. He had known about the war between Romardin and Romarkia. His grandfather had fought in it, helping to defend their homeland against the dual invaders of Capistonia from the south and Romarkia from the west. That gross nation was located on the Romarkian Sea. Aneptius prided himself on the patriotism he showed towards Romardin, and associating with a former enemy was the last thing this dwarf had wanted to do, though Dorothy did seem kindly enough, so on the outset. "Ah, from Romarkia. Still suffering in those defeats we handed you, eh?" Aneptius said this with no regard to the present state of things. Dorothy turned crimson at the mention of the war, like any civilized person in those days would. It was not something often made light of in polite society, but he was a more than reasonable fellow to know by the tone of Aneptius's voice that it wasn't a harsh jab, but merely a friendly joke. "Well, you can take it from me that I had no intention of talking about the war tonight, but we've quite recovered well. You'd be surprised by how wonderfully shipbuilding does in times of crisis. Though people always stay hungry, which is great for me." He said this last statement with a crooked smile, assuming that Aneptius knew his profession already. "You're a cook?" "No, I wish sometimes. My parents run a small tavern in Vinorg. I just run the tables." Aneptius looked him up and down, and finally focused on his chest before saying, "Ha! I don't see any tits." At this point in the conversation they had just about finished their pint, and another one was on its happy journey to their table. They both stared a bit at the barmaid when those beers were dropped off. They moved on talking, smiling all the while, with Aneptius holding his head up with an elbow rested on the table, the other around the gangly handle of his mug. Aneptius was enjoying his time there talking with Dwarf. He wobbled back and forth a bit, but still he kept his head raised up above the table. It seemed like Dorothy could outdrink anyone by Aneptius's standards, but then again, anyone could outdrink Aneptius. "So tell me, why are you over here, in this quiet place, when it sounds so great over there in Vinorg?" Aneptius said with a large grin on his face. The pretty tavern wench strode by their table again. It was almost as if she was strutting around just for their entertainment. The woman always bent low when placing new drinks on the table for the two. "Damn, she's pretty cute, Dorothy. Maybe I'll try my luck. You know, women really enjoy my company." Aneptius was slurring his words at this point. I think this is the last one for you. I'll help you out, but only if you're more sober. Dorothy laughed at the prospects of setting his newly found friend up with this simple tavern lass. The real challenge lay in getting the dwarf to stop drinking so much. Hey, I can get 'em however I want, with or without your help, buddy. Aneptius then tried getting up to go talk to her. Found his legs were a bit too wobbly for his liking, so he went to sit down again. Oh, I'm just tired from the road, and working all the time. Dorothy grabbed him by the shoulder and gave a familial squeeze to it. Sure, and I'll be here to help you out. To answer your question before I forgot, I came here to study the mountains and coal roundabouts here. My parents have done well enough after the war stopped that they're now able to provide this opportunity for me. I would have been out of the house by now anyways, he added as an afterstatement, not drawing much attention to it. What do you study here? Neptune started to draw out the last words a bit. I study the Kola Mountains, you idiot. I just said that. Doris said it with a comfortable smile. He tried to ignore that it was the third time Aneptius had asked that question. Aneptius didn't realize it at first, but for a dwarf, he had a rather lackluster and scrappy beard. This made him trust Dorothy just a little less. Any self-respecting dwarf would put his heart into his beard. Oh, now it makes sense why you talk funny. My brain didn't connect the reason before. Aneptius leaned heavier on the table. Dorothy blushed a little. I was hoping I didn't have much of an accent. Well, I'd say it's pretty good for a student. If you weren't one, then you'd not have any accent at all. The academic types likes to put on airs. And I know. Aneptius was genuinely impressed by Dorothy's ability at speaking Romardan. It was a rather difficult language to master. Aneptius had always wondered how difficult it must be to learn for someone who hadn't grown up speaking it. Why are you even bothering to learn about the coal? All you need to know is Gorgonus provides us with the best quality in the kingdom. Just be happy it's here. Aneptius brought out a slight chuckle as he was struggling to keep his eyes open. Dorothy rolled his eyes on this one, yet still managed to laugh. There are always things in nature a man must learn about. The way it burns is different from the rest of the world. Plus, Romardan fascinates me. Huh? What fascinates you? Well, the first thing is that dwarves are in charge everywhere here. It's quite strange, All the humans I've met so far have been serfs. Whereas in Romarkia, everyone is on relatively the same footing, except for the merchant rulers. Neptius giggled at this response. Oh, I got a surprise for you. My family is serfs, and I'm a serf too. Dorothy was intrigued by this chance encounter, even more so. Why are you serfs? And yet no other dwarves I met have been. Is it different out here in the village? Can't tell you why. Don't know why. Just always has been. And no, nothing's different here, except you probably just met the only dwarven serf in all Romardan. Interesting. Are you serious? You don't know any other dwarf serfs? Nope, don't know 'em. And even if I did, I wouldn't care to know 'em. Neptius's eyes seemed to filter ever faster between being open and closed. He was having a mighty hard struggle to stay awake. Dorothy ordered some fried bread as Ineptius stared at the ass of the waitress whenever she wandered back and forth between tables. Ineptius always seemed to have this problem when it came to women. No matter how hard he tried, he could not keep his eyes off of them. They were always just too attractive to him. Ineptius noticed a particularly ugly dwarf who had wide ears jumping off of an irregularly thin pointed face, and an unusually eggish head. He started to laugh. Ha! Damn! Look at that guy over there, dwarf. Looks like a fucking vampire. Ineptius started pointing. His friend had to lower his arm for him to prevent the man from noticing. Dorothy started to laugh as well, since it was an unusually funny sight. The image did in fact bring to mind that of a vampire, though no one had raised the alarm about vampires in quite a long time. It was still bad manners, and could get someone killed as a result of the accusation. The Asheki were always on the prowl. Oh, shut up, Dorothy giggled. Don't be calling people vampires now. Haven't seen one since I was a kid. Let's just agree he's more than a bit ugly. They both started to crack up at looking at this fellow dwarf. Oi! I just ran into a fucking vampire earlier today. Ineptius teetered off laughing. The bald-headed dwarf was particularly funny, since most of their kind always retained their hair, even into their most late ages. If someone lost it before then, they tended to be seen as weird oddities, most likely men who were becoming more feminine, because they could not swing the axe as before. Hey, you're a pretty funny guy, Ineptius. I haven't had a good laugh like this in some time. You never told me what brings you in here, Doris stated, still finishing up the laughter that had just broken out. I'll tell you, Doris. There's this annoying fucker in charge of my village who commanded that I go find something, 'cause some reason. Ooh, real damn spooky. Now I know the village relies on me. Some dwarf serf among all the other dwarves who are either reitzers or dwarning or merchants. He goes and he chooses me. I could hardly believe it. I should just leave that son of a bitch behind. Ineptius was still slurring his words, though his eyes seemed fully at attention, no longer sliding swiftly back and forth between awake and asleep. Dorothy was utterly intrigued by this. He kept rapt attention on Ineptius the entire time whilst that dwarf was speaking. It seemed to be a very strange set of circumstances that had brought this dwarf here. So why don't you? Don't what? Just up and run off like you want. Oh, 'cause he'll free me. Plus, my family's still here. I can't just abandon them. Ineptius rubbed the side of his head and shook it hard. Clearly, he was getting upset at the prospect of having to return simply to free his own family from the clutches of Ornorian. I always forget you serfs aren't allowed free movement from your lands. You're right, too. It is strange that he would send a serf to go do what would be a knight's job. Your remark is Sean. At least this blunder by Dorothy helped to lighten the mood. I always forget you people don't have knights over there. Over here, it seems a bit too majestic for the mountains, having great steel-clad men riding horses about. And you're damned right it's too majestic. We use real beasts that can tear your horses to bits. And we did use them. Neptys laughed in delight at the prospect of a knight fighting a Reitzar and his horse fighting a Zaik. And Neptys recovered from his laughter at the prospect. Whoa. Tell me more about yourself, dwarf. And so, this new dwarf did. And that's the end of chapter 5. New meeting. The end of chapter 5 meeting of my second book, Deviations of Defiance, which you can pick up from Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below. Don't forget to check out my other works, Rumblings in Ramarden and The Kingdom Swell, which you can find there also. And please like, share, and subscribe to these videos. And I hope you all enjoyed and can't wait to do the next one. Bye.